Good morning, and thank you for joining us today for another webinar. Today, we'll be discussing the road ahead for electric car sales. My name is Simbiat Yusuf, and our attendees, we ask that you please submit your questions through the attendee chat. We will also be sending the webinar presentation shortly after the webinar today. And as we begin all of our webinars, we give a brief introduction to Forth, who we are and what we do. For some of you, you're new to our webinar, so we will start with that. Forth is a nonprofit trade association advocating for smart transportation. We are working in four main focus areas, which are industry growth and development, policy advocacy, consumer engagement, demonstration, and pilot projects. We hope that you can find more information about Forth, our membership, and our work on our website at forthmobility.org. And on June 15th through the 19th of 2020, Forth is hosting 5 engaging roadmap panel sessions that was supposed to be held in conjunction with EVS 33. You can join us on June 15th for equitable transportation electrification, on the 16th for consumer engagement and EV adoption, 17th for cities leading the transportation electrification charge, the 18th for charging heavy-duty electric vehicles, and on the 19th, electrifying shared mobility. We'll be sending a link to these webinars on our recap, and we hope you can look forward to the Roadmap standalone event coming back on June 29th through the 30th of 2021. Save the date and more information to come on that. And we hope you can join Forth EV Hybrid Noir in partnership with CARB for the e-mobility equity town hall conference via Zoom. This will be held on Thursday, May 28, 2020 at 11 a.m. Pacific time. We hope you're able to join that as well. And the National E-Mobility Equity Conference will be held on November 20th, 2020. This has been rescheduled from happening this June. So we hope you're able to join us then. You can find more information about all of these events at our website at forthmobility.org or on our events page. And then now we will pass it along to our moderator today, Jeff, who will give an introduction to today's topics and our speakers today. Back to you, Jeff.
Thanks so much, Simbi. So my name is Jeff Allen. I'm Executive Director of Forth and really thrilled to be moderating here today. As many of you know, and as Simbi just touched on, a big part of Forth's work is in promoting accelerated sales of electric vehicles, electric cars, and other electric transportation. So we have a very keen interest in this topic. Typically this time of year, we'd be operating our downtown showroom in downtown Portland. We'd be hosting dozens of ride and drive events all over the country, and we would be doing outreach to employers, to dealers. Obviously, we're not doing any of that, and we don't know when we're going to be able to get back to all of that. So in trying to get a handle on what this pandemic and economic recession are going to mean for electric vehicle sales, we did what we do best, which is ask a lot of other smart, thoughtful people to share their opinions with us. And so we have a great panel for you here today. Yeah, I'm talking about you, John. So we're going to have a few minutes of initial remarks from each of our speakers. We're not going to have long PowerPoint presentations. And then after those initial remarks, we're going to open it up to questions from you all. And again, please put those questions into the chat, and we're going to take it away. So we're going to start with Joel Levin, who's Executive Director of Plug-in America. Joel is an advocate for low carbon technologies, a frequent speaker and writer on topics related to electric vehicles and clean energy, and has been leading Plug-in America for several years now as the leading independent voice for electric vehicles and electric vehicle drivers in the United States. So Joel, tell us your thoughts on what this is all going to mean for electric vehicle sales.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jeff, and thank you to Forth for having me here this morning. So I wanted to highlight kind of 6 big trends that I think I'm seeing in the EV market right now. So first of all, this won't shock you, that car sales are going to drop this year. That in the last recession, 2008, car sales in the US dropped 40% in the first year. And so I don't think it'll be shocking to see overall car sales drop something in that range, or maybe even deeper. Bloomberg has said that they think car sales globally will drop about 23% in 2020. So that shouldn't shock anyone. Car sales are going to drop. And Bloomberg predicts it'll take 5 years, up to 2025, to get back to 2019 car sales. So second trend is that EV sales are going to drop also, but not as much. And we're seeing that already in Europe. There's a number of countries where EV sales have fallen, but not nearly as much as overall sales of ICE cars. And so, in fact, their market share has grown as the market has shrank. And Bloomberg also predicts that they're forecasting an 18% global drop in EV sales, which means a slight increase in market share. And I wouldn't be surprised if it's market share creeps up in some measurable amount, because I'd like to believe EV sales are a little bit stickier and people are a little bit more committed to buying EVs than ICE cars. So we'll see how that plays out. But I think we're likely to see a trend something like that. Third is that in the short run, car manufacturers, the legacy manufacturers, are going to focus on the models that make them the most money, which is to say trucks and SUVs, that as the market is shrinking, they're going to focus on where their money is, which is, so in the immediate term, I think there's going to be kind of a big push on trucks and SUVs and kind of things that make legacy dealers, car manufacturers, more money. But I don't know that that'll play out over the long term, but at least that's kind of the short-term likelihood. Fourth is that R&D is going to slow. We've already seen some studies that show that manufacturers are slowing down their R&D investments, slowing down releases of new models. The overall direction is not changing at all. So car manufacturers have spent tens of billions of dollars investing in EV research and the new models of EVs, and all those investments are not going away. All those EV models are not going away. I think it'll be a little bit slower. You might see a 3-6 month lag in the rollout, but those are still coming. Fifth trend, and this is something, it's still pretty speculative. We'll see how it plays out. But so factories all over the US and all over the world have been stopped. They've stopped manufacturing for a couple of months, and they're just now getting started. Most of the US car factories are actually kind of retooling and getting up to speed this week. But what I think will be interesting to watch is that I assume the manufacturers are not going to start everything at once and not going to bring everything up to 100% production in 1 second, because they know that sales are going to be slow, and manufacturers, the thing they hate most is sitting on a lot of unsold vehicles. So I think they're going to be very careful about ramping up their production, and I think that we may see some of their less popular models, some of the sedans that haven't been selling as well, they may not restart those. So there may be somewhat of a shift to the trucks and SUVs, as I said, and some of their sedans that haven't done as well. We may not see those continue, which means they're going to have a bunch of factories sitting around empty. And I think that could accelerate the EV trend a little bit, that it is easier to launch a brand new model that you've been working on and engineering for a couple of years when you've got a bunch of spare capacity sitting around, rather than when you're producing full bore. So that's my guess right now. We'll watch and see how that plays out, but I think that could be interesting to see. And then the last thing to mention is with dealerships. Dealers have been really struggling. This has been a really rough time for dealerships, and we're hearing that a lot of smaller dealerships may just not reopen at all. It's been really tough on them. And to scramble to respond to this, many dealers have been shifting away from the traditional dealership model, that you walk into a dealership and they sell you a car, to more of an online model, more similar to like the Tesla experience, and the experience of, frankly, how consumers are used to buying pretty much everything else, which is you go online, you order it on a website, someone brings it to your house. And dealers have kind of resisted that model for selling cars. And as we know, EV buyers tend to really have a poor experience at the dealership. For a lot of reasons, the dealers are not very good at selling EVs. And so I think if they get to more of an online model, I think that's going to be a positive thing if that sticks. If that continues to happen after the pandemic, which I think is likely it will, that consumers kind of like that model better. And particularly EV buyers like that model better, where it's like they know what they want. They just don't want the salesman to get in the way. And so if they can order it online and the dealership just brings it to their house and they can avoid all of the other conversation and maybe cross-selling to other models, I think the buyers are going to like that. So I'd like to think that this is going to result in an improved sales experience for EV consumers. So I'll stop there and let the other speakers go. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Joel. So next up is John Voelcker. He's been was editor of Clean Car Reports for 9 years, publishing more than 12,000 articles on hybrids, electric cars, and other low and zero emission vehicles and the ecosystem around them. Now covers advanced auto technologies and energy policy as a reporter and analyst. Many of you will know John best as the voice of our roadmap conference for several years early on. So great to have you back, John. What do you see your crystal ball telling you? Whoops, I think you're on mute.
Mute button, not mute button on keyboard. Sorry. I pretty much agree with everything Joel said. I come at it from a slightly different point of view, which is that if you look globally, autos are a global industry, and they're going to get hurt globally somewhat differently in different markets. I think overall, I don't expect EVs to be hurt more than regular cars or internal combustion engine cars overall, but it will differ in different markets. The European example that Joel mentioned is really a result of regulation. But while we've heard a lot about individual electric car projects getting delayed or canceled, Ford's Rivian Lincoln project and things like that, other vehicles are being delayed as well, what we call mid-cycle upgrades, that really don't get as much press. And so it hits both sides. To have a sale, to get the industry back on its feet, you need supply and demand. And supply is ramping back up. China is pretty much back in business now. Europe and the US are on roughly similar schedules. This is the week that the US started to get some of its factories back going. And that will continue through the rest of May, June, and July. And there's a scenario that if we don't have further outbreaks and if everything goes well, by, let's say, Labor Day, you could have the bulk of the global industry back in a position to produce most of what it produced in January. But the other side of the equation is demand. You have to have demand, and that's really the big question. Will people continue to buy cars? The epidemic has, at least where I'm from in New York, disproportionately hurt those on the bottom end of the economic scale. And they are not, by and large, the people who are buying new cars, because less than half of all Americans can afford to buy a new car now. We focus on new car sales, but actually there are 3 times as many used cars sold as new cars. But the electric vehicles, by and large, for this decade will be new cars. Early sales numbers from April indicate that, in fact, more trucks are being sold than passenger cars, which probably reflects that. And my surmise is that, in fact, the people who bought in April were those who had cash in the bank and could do it. But let's look at the driver. Right now, today, globally, EV sales are driven by regulation. In China, which bought more plug-in cars than the entire rest of the world last year, China has had for 15 years the goal of dominating global production of photovoltaic solar cells, so that's done, lithium-ion battery cells, well on the road to that, and plug-in cars. Early days yet, but they fully intend, the Chinese auto industry, to have the largest share of plug-in cars to be bought because they think it'll give them a global competitive advantage. Okay, Europe is buying more plug-in cars this year, as Joel mentioned, because as of January 1st, the regulations limiting carbon dioxide emissions from tailpipes really started to bite. And so a zero-emission vehicle is worth a lot to every automaker in avoided fines for having too high tailpipe emissions. Things are different in North America, and I have always, I've maintained for the last couple of years, especially under the current administration, that North America is really in danger of falling behind the global trend and becoming less and less relevant to the global discussion on EVs. But everything changes sometime this decade. And remember, cars are sort of 5 to 7 year product cycles. They're inordinately expensive to develop, even the traditional kind. And so as you look out to 2025, the big thing that changes is that major global automakers, the largest ones, say that's when they become profitable. They can actually make money on electric vehicles with 200 plus mile ranges, which they certainly haven't done collectively in the last decade. Once everything becomes profitable in 2025, then they have an incentive to market the damn things and actually get people to try to buy them, which they really haven't been in any meaningful way to date. That is the traditional industry. Then there's Tesla, which is a totally separate issue. But the last point I want to make before handing over to Chelsea is that, in a way, this may not have been such a bad time for a pause from the EV frame, because in North America, there just aren't that many new EVs coming out in the next year or so. We heard a lot about the Mustang Mach-E being delayed into next year. That was going to come out this fall. But really, the only significant new EV on the market this year for 2020 is the Tesla Model Y. And that will probably be a large proportion of the EVs that get sold. Nissan has nothing new. Chevrolet has nothing new. All of the European ones are very low volume. So 2021 and 22 will see a whole slew of new products, but those are only going to be incrementally affected, I think, this year by the pandemic. So in the end, EVs won't be hurt any more than ICE cars, I think, globally.
Okay. Thank you. And batting third, we have Chelsea Sexton, who's been working to accelerate electric transportation since the 90s, starting with the GM EV1, which I'm going to trust that most people on this call know a little bit about. And her diverse adventures since have included co-founding Plug-in America, guiding Vantage Point Capital Partners' early investment in Tesla, and directing an Automotive X Prize. Chelsea, what do you see for the future of electric vehicle sales?
Well, I think anyone that pretends any of this is more than a damp finger in the wind is probably kidding themselves to some degree. So we'll start there. But I think John's largely right about the actual automaker effect. We're not seeing a lot of movement yet away from EVs, a little bit of a delay, but not a lot with respect to programs being killed. And the one that got anyone's attention was the one no one really was all that excited about in the first place. But even before coronavirus, there was so much focus on China and Europe that what is likely true is that the US will continue to backslide in terms of its regional leadership in EV deployment. I hope I'm wrong, but so far no reason to believe that we are, because Europe and China and other areas have stronger, more consistent policy in this direction. Meanwhile, here, on one hand, more states are joining the CARB-ZEV program, yay, and no one is looking at the blue skies these days going, yeah, we should roll back all of that. But the EPA and CARB street fight has yet to play out, and 25 years of experience for me says the automakers will also continue to beg for leniency and more time out of financial hardship, whether it applies or not. I know there are some automaker people on this call. Please prove me wrong. There's also an interesting paradox with respect to autonomous vehicles that we're starting to see. Where there are cuts being made, it tends to be more on those programs and delays to those programs versus electric. But there's also an upswing in hype starting to happen around the notion that autonomous vehicles for deliveries and goods movement will will have a resurgence and acceleration because of fear of the virus and more people staying at home, just having things delivered to them. So it's incumbent upon us to also continue to ensure that autonomous miles are electric miles, that increases in VMT are not based on gasoline. And the policy push in that direction was starting to happen, but has backed off a little bit because some of the hype on AVs had started to back off, but it's something we should keep an eye on. With respect to the market, everyone's talking about, no one's going to trust transit or shared mobility of any kind ever again. Everyone's going to move to private cars, and yet the other side is saying all of that would be catastrophic, which is fair. And the upshot is we don't actually know what will happen. Everything is based on polling and people assuming they know what they're going to do going forward. But at the same time, lower income, people of color, folks are still riding transit that don't have other options and still need to get to work. And those that choose to switch to private cars are going to be those that can afford to do so. And to points that both John and Joel have made, the EVs that are being deployed in the next couple of years are primarily the ones that are meant for people that are least affected from a financial perspective by this virus. So yes, there will be some shift probably in modes, but it's way too soon to predict that everyone's going to, wholesale ditch transit or anything else for more private passenger vehicles, and that as a result, that's going to have a great resurgence. At the end, mode switching will apply to those that can afford to do so, but it means that we have to continue to focus on what we intend to happen. We may find that nanoseptic materials, other learnings around the spread of the virus may mitigate some of this anyway. We might be able to tamp down, from a behavioral perspective, both some of the fear and some of the spread, and be able to contain and preserve use of those things. It's also, the best guess is a couple years with respect to a vaccine and kind of getting back to normal. A couple years is not that long in the grand scheme. So I have some concern around all the energy of let's just give up on all these other modes and refocus on private passenger vehicles, which is dangerous in the end and conflicting with the municipal movement at the moment. EVs are not cars per se. Electric transportation is our goal, electric miles in whatever vehicle it is. And we have to continue to foster and discourage throwing the baby out with the bathwater on some of this stuff. What we do know for sure is that some people will have reduced need for a car. Some will have reduced need for full-time car access, and that we're going to need to refocus on access to transportation over ownership from a need perspective, but also from an economic perspective. Fewer people are going to be able to afford to have a private car, and we might need to revisit and re-explore some of the shared or subscription or other models that didn't necessarily make sense in the before times, but could have more merit now. We also need to think more about infrastructure deployment, how travel patterns and road trip desire and all those things may change in the next few years, and refocus around more urban needs possibly, as well as consider that there will likely be fewer dollars available for a lot of these things. And then we need to get much smarter around better asset utilization of cars, of chargers, of everything involved in all of this. And that may go toward more mixed use charging, workplace by day, local multi-unit dwelling by night, maybe permit-based, whatever. But there are places in which we can mix use cases to make all of this better used, but also more affordable for everybody involved. And then finally, one of the things that is starting to happen regardless is more cities are starting to consider how they want to reinvent themselves from an urban planning perspective. And the slow streets movement that we're starting to see is one example of that. So is the bicycle shortage that's becoming the new toilet paper shortage. And so what we don't know going forward, but that we have a role to play here, is how things look after the fact and not necessarily re-implementing the same status quo we've had so far.
Great. Well, we have a bunch of questions coming in. Let's just start things with a lively one, because a couple of you touched on the role of regulations in driving this. So let me just ask you to assess how important is to take this as a partisan comment, but how important is the outcome of the November election relative to the importance of this virus and recession, if you're forced to weigh the two? Do you think that's as important in what happens to EV sales over the next few years, More important, slightly less important.
In other words, what's more
Can we
important,
go for
the virus
Barry?
or the outcome of the election? I would say that the virus has a short-term impact. I don't think that 10 years from now, what happens with the virus is going to have a long-term impact on car sales. I think it's going to slow things down, but that it's going to incrementally go back to where it would have been otherwise. The election, on the other hand, I think could have a big impact. I mean, not just car sales, but on our society as a whole. I think the outcome of this election is really profound. EVs, I believe, are a fundamentally better technology, and I think that EVs will eventually be the way that we all drive, no matter what happens politically in this country, because it's a better technology. But in order to achieve the time frame that we need to have a meaningful impact on climate change, we need to have the policy now. If EVs dominate the world in 40 years, that's not soon enough. So this election is really, really important in terms of our ability to hit the targets that we need to make greenhouse gas reductions to protect our environment. So I think that's really important.
Okay. Either of you two want to take that on, or should we move to something a little less? Let me ask.
I don't think it's controversial. I mean, whatever side you sit on, nobody's saying, yeah, this election doesn't matter for any number of reasons. But at the same time, I mean, EVs have always been driven by external forces. That has a large degree been the early advocates, and the market itself has always kind of been a pull model. But policy has always driven electrification, whether carrot or stick. So there is no competition here in terms of which one is more important and has more potential impact on the future of electric vehicles. It is the election, hands down.
Okay, let me pivot a little bit and ask, maybe starting with you, John, what impact do you think that this is going to have on the prices for electric vehicles?
Well, at the moment, the prices for electric vehicles are somewhat artificial, because if they were priced to cover their costs, they probably wouldn't sell as well as they need to in order to accomplish the regulatory goals that are requiring them to be sold in the first place. That said, there are numerous car companies now making noises about $100 a kilowatt hour and less within a very few years. And if that's your holy grail, you can sort of do the math and figure out what kinds of cars with a 200 or 300 mile range need to be sold at that cost of batteries that will cover their own costs. And, how does that become profitable? What I see is that the first round of electric cars were quite logically small C-segment hatchbacks, because that has been the most common car segment globally. And also it's easier to make a small hatchback efficient than it is a big honking truck. However, America buys lots of big honking trucks, and the numbers are going up as a percentage. What I expect, and this is particularly in regard to General Motors and their forthcoming dozen or so BEV3 vehicles with their new Ultium battery, etc., is that they are all going to be on the expensive side of average. And I'm not expecting huge volumes for any of those particular vehicles, at least in the early years. But if you sell a bunch of them in every GM brand across 2 or 3 different types of vehicle, then you add up to reasonable numbers. But I'm not seeing the $25,000 electric car before incentives anytime in the next 5 years.
Either of you disagree with that? So I think what I'm hearing is battery prices may impact car prices, but otherwise it's more a question of what's the price point of the particular vehicle rather than that price point coming down necessarily. That makes sense.
And if I could extend, Tesla did it the traditional way. They started at the top of the market and moved down from very expensive to slightly less expensive to slightly above the average. That's how you always do it. This idea of starting with small cars like Priuses is not how innovation happens in the auto industry.
Yeah, I mean, I think one potential nuance to this is that there has been for some time a little bit of a parallel path that's been happening. There is an appetite, and I think it's mostly been underestimated, for low to mid range, but more affordable EVs that are specifically meant to be more commuter cars. While some automakers, and especially the premium ones, understandably, have been driving for more range at any cost. But we've seen, beside even from the compliance cars, sort of Nissan went down this path for a while. There's a little bit of the thinking of, 150 to 225 miles is kind of enough, and that the goal should be to get the price down so that more people can afford them versus necessarily more range. As travel patterns shift in the near to midterm, that may become more viable than it once was. I mean, this notion of transportation needs will refocus less around the great American road trip probably, and more around day-to-day needs, which may impact, along with the economic implications, the types of vehicles that are suddenly making more sense than might have 2 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that there's a limited demand for cars that go 100 miles or 150 miles. People are really looking for more. I think the sweet spot is probably around 250. And as battery prices come down, when automakers can make an equivalent electric car to a gas car that goes 250-ish range, then I think the world starts to get really interesting. When you can have a suite of cars across the gamut from small to large that are equivalent in price to a gas car, and they get 250 plus miles in range, I think that'll start to be a really interesting world, and hopefully we'll be there, in 5 years or so. And that starts to really move the needle, because ultimately when you talk about the price of EVs, I think you're talking about the price of batteries, and the price of batteries is driven by scale. So if we're selling fewer cars, I've got to assume that the price of batteries is going to come down a little bit more slowly, but it is still coming down as volume increases.
So we've had a couple of questions about the used electric vehicle market that I want to get to. And again, I assume you can't talk about that without talking about the broader used car market. And I've seen a fair amount of coverage about people not being able to make their car payments and a glut of used cars coming back into the market. But could you all talk a little bit about what you see happening, particularly to the used electric car market in the next few years? And I don't know who wants to take that one first. Chelsea, maybe? You're smiling.
I'm always smiling.
Well, and I can count on you to have an opinion, right?
That's usually fair too. Yeah, I mean, obviously the used car market is going to be affected by the new car market. In some ways, there will be more appetite for used cars. At the same time, the value will likely decline just as new cars will as well. I mean, there's certainly long been a need from an electrification perspective for us to focus more around used cars than we have been. And that opportunity remains for us to do things that make people more comfortable with used EVs, to better ensure the quality of used EVs, to facilitate really consistent and insurable battery condition and warranty and things like that, so that people are not concerned that they're buying something 5 or 10 years old that will next year go 30 miles. At the same time, as we talk about the access versus ownership programs, a lot of those sorts of more subscription-y kind of models are premised on the notion of lately used cars to make them make more economic sense than if you're putting a bunch of new cars into a subscription model. So there's a bunch of opportunity there above and beyond what literally happens with the used car market across the board.
Yeah, I don't think that the used car market is going to be dramatically affected by the coronavirus and what's going on. I mean, at Plug in America, we've always thought the used car market is kind of like the little secret of the EV market, that used EVs are a great deal. There's a lot of really reasonably priced used EVs out there that are a couple of years old, still basically have 100% of their battery capacity, and they're really cheap. Tesla aside, because Teslas hold their value so much, but the other used EVs that have declined in price, just like most cars do, and still are totally adequate, are kind of the big secret of the EV market. And I don't know that that's changed. And maybe because if people are have less income and they're looking more at used cars, they'll discover that. But I've always been a big fan of used EVs.
I thought you were going in a totally different direction with that, Joel. Used Teslas behave like used cars normally in the market because they are not substantively less performing than the new ones. Whereas the first 5 years of EVs were all under 100 miles of range. And now with a 230 or a 250 mile car from the same maker available in the showroom that may look kind of the same, the rest of the used EV market may be of value for certain buyers who have certain drive cycles. But Americans tend to be fairly reluctant to buy cars that are really, really limited in use, unless they're toy cars, Jeeps or whatever. But, a car that had a new range of 84 miles that now maybe has a range of 70 or 75 miles that looks kind of like the one that has twice that, I think is going to be a problematic sell. The market will price everything, and they may be good values for the people who can use them that way. But America has spent 70 years building very low density, dispersed suburban housing with miles or tens of miles between houses and jobs and retail. And people buy cars for their maximum imagined usage. So I'm a little more skeptical on the value of the first round of used electric cars. Once we get a whole bunch of used 200-mile electric cars out there, different story.
Well, let me give you an example. So I have two cars. One of my cars is a 2015 Nissan Leaf. Okay, it goes 84 miles, just like you mentioned. And for getting around town, it is totally adequate and fine, and it still has 100% of its capacity. It hasn't really deteriorated at all. It's not a great road car. I wouldn't drive it to Las Vegas. I live in LA. But for getting around town, I use it 99% of the time. If I'm going to take a road trip, I use my other car, which happens to be a Volt. And so, but for people who have like two cars in their family, or for have the need for just getting around town, it's a great car, and they're very inexpensive, and there's a zillion of them available. So yeah, it depends. You have to be disciplined about understanding what your needs are.
That's the problem. So, with the greatest of respect, I don't think any of the four of us are average car buyers.
Fair point. I think it's one thing we can all agree on. And it sounds to me like we could do a whole nother webinar on used electric vehicles. So, but moving on, we had a couple of questions too about fleets. And that's a question that I know has come up in our discussions here. Should this all argue for us to focus more on fleets and institutions rather than individual buyers? Some people have argued that they are more rational. I have my own opinions about that. But is that something we should be thinking about?
Of course this is a yes and kind of question. It's the perfect tee up for not an either or, but yeah, of course. There has already been a parallel path between, retail passenger cars and medium heavy duty things, non-road goods movement, even port, truck stop, airport, all of those things. So yes, we should continue all of those. There will be certain programs that we should have that more granular discussion of, is it better to shift money from one pot to another? But overall, we have to continue going down both paths. There are some people that work discreetly on one side or another. There are some of us that sort of work on all of them and other grout between the potential tiles. But we don't have the luxury of that kind of a choice given the scale of the challenge ahead of us. And from a climate change perspective, from an air quality perspective, you name it, we have to push forward in all of the things, and they do have shared components between them that the economies of scale will only benefit from continuing to use them in all of the different use cases we can.
Yeah,
Dang.
agree.
What Chelsea said.
What Chelsea said, right? That's always safe.
Yes, and let me open it up a little more broadly and ask the question of, given this environment we're in, those of us who are trying to move forward electric transportation of all kinds, how should our work be evolving? Are there certain kinds of things that I mean, obviously, we're not doing ride and drive events right now, or things like that. But are there things that we should be focusing more on, or that this is a uniquely good time to be trying to do to move this market forward?
Well, unfortunately, yes, we found that the most powerful way to promote EVs is to let people experience them directly, to let people touch them and sit in them and drive around in them, and you can't do that right now. So that's a big buzzkill for the promoting EVs. That's a big challenge. So the alternative is doing things virtually because it's what we've got right now. So we've been experimenting a lot with how do you do virtual events? How do you do things that are online that can convey information, that can convey the feeling of test driving a car to create kind of an experiential learning experience online? And it's not perfect, but there's a lot of creative stuff that's going on right now with sort of experimenting on alternatives to actually, driving the car and having the in-person experience. And it's there, and so hopefully I think some interesting stuff will come out of it, and maybe some mechanisms for promoting EVs that didn't exist before that are so powerful that they'll stick. But that's kind of, that's where we are.
Chelsea, John, anything to add there?
The only thing I completely agree. The only thing I would add is that this is also in some ways an opportunity to sort of get ready to go faster when we are able to. So yes, everyone's kind of in this period of uncertainty. There are a few things we know, there's lots that we don't. This is also not necessarily a long-term condition. This is the next months and maybe a couple of years kind of thing. But there will be ride and drives again. There will be better practices to understand how to facilitate them while reducing risk, all of those things. And so we have to be a little bit careful about saying, something is completely off the table going forward. It's too soon to say that about almost anything. So yes, we need to do more virtually. And frankly, current EV owners have been asking for years for better tools to help them talk to their friends and neighbors about these cars they love so much. We long should have gotten better at that, and now is an opportunity to continue to do so. So there's some known things we can do, but also to get ready to, there's a lot that can be done behind the scenes to get ready to go faster when we are able to. Especially in the US, it's going to be largely regional. Some states will open up quicker than others. There may be a resurgence in some areas. There's no one tool for all jobs kind of thinking that's going to apply here.
I agree, and the only thing I would add is that it is the enthusiasm of the owners that really is doing a lot of the marketing in the absence of auto companies actually effectively and sort of pervasively marketing these things. What are the online tools for doing an online test drive? Hey, here's a kind of car that you have an owner who is willing to strap a camera onto their lapel and go for a drive and answer your questions while they do it.
Right. We're struggling right now with what does National Drive Electric Week look like this coming fall, because we're starting to see that it's not going to be completely normal. I don't think the world's going to be back to where it was by the end of September when Drive Electric Week comes up. And we have this challenge that we've got. Last year we had 300 plus events in every state in the country and every province of Canada. And we've got all of that energy and excitement. As John pointed out, this is really the excitement of the drivers that want to share this experience. And so we're looking at a Drive Electric Week this year that's going to be kind of a mix of, probably there will be places in the country where it's safe enough to do test drive events with sort of social distancing, and there's going to be other places where it's probably not. And so we're struggling with what are the tools? How do you do this in a way that channels that energy? Because that energy is still there. People who, it's sort of the secret weapon of the electric car world is the drivers and their incredible passion, their incredible commitment. And how do we channel that in a way that allows them to still do that in a world where, we have to all social distance? So
I'm also reminded of several years ago, there used to be some appetite for virtual test drive apps. And there were a couple that were really well done. Virtual Vehicle Drive, Laura Schewel, who's now running Streetlight Data, did one when she was at RMI. Some of those were really good tools that never really got embraced because we were able to do lots of physical test drives. And so the notion of downloading something to your phone and driving around on your normal day-to-day, driving for a month at a time or whatever, and then going to a site that would show you exactly which vehicles would work with your actual habits. If you were looking at a plug-in hybrid, when in your commute it would switch over to gas, all of those things were very cool features, but less embraced at the time because we didn't have to. Now, some of those things will make much more sense as well. And so we need to start thinking more broadly about what does virtual mean? It's not just Zoom meetings, as fun as those can be, but there are other digital tools that we can employ.
Let me ask too, we had a couple of questions about things like signage and smart charging. And it strikes me that this may also be a window when, okay, if we're not selling as many of the cars, that doesn't mean, maybe it's an opportunity to get ahead of things on the charging side, or to make the charging we have more visible, or to get the policies in place for building codes, or to get the policies in place to enable more smart charging. Any thoughts about that? And if I could make it an even more complicated question, several people have pointed out that obviously cities and states are facing existential budget crises and laying people off. And, if we have, if we're struggling to keep teachers and cops on the payroll, what can we do that doesn't cost much, that helps kind of plow the ground?
Well, signage is a thing I've been harping on for 20 years. That one of the things we learned back even from the EV1 days, when General Motors was paying for half of the charging that was installed and we were the ones doing it, is that no matter how much charging we put in, people kept saying there's not enough charging, there's not enough charging, when ultimately there was much more out there than they thought there were because they were not used to seeing it. And so they just didn't notice it. We're used to gas stations looking very consistent, chargers don't, or it's in a corner of a parking lot or whatever. And finally, what we learned is that we didn't always need more charging, but we needed more physical signage. On highways, yes, but also off highways. And that it was especially important for all of the people that didn't yet have EVs. It's a marketing tool as much as anything else, and signs are much cheaper than chargers. I would argue that problem has only gotten worse because all of the EV drivers now have apps. And so everyone's used to thinking we're providing for them. And therefore, if they all have apps, we don't have to worry so much about the physical signage. And so there's less of it, when in fact we need just as much or more, because the point is still the non-EV drivers. So yes, I would wholeheartedly embrace signage of a variety of forms, but something that's consistent look that people will start to identify with chargers, even though they don't all look the same. And smart charging and other things that are lower cost potentially, but could make some of this make more sense. Ancillary services is another topic that comes up a lot, is at least vehicle to home or building, if not to grid. And it'll be interesting to see. I know Pecan Street is already doing some analysis of this, how peak periods are changing with people staying at home, especially with the fact, where EVs specifically have an impact on that. So we may see different points of day that we need to encourage people to charge or not than we are historically used to seeing, that will add more value to the overall proposition of having an electric car. We also need to embrace utilities and others that will want to do some of these things and need encouragement to do so, and who will have capital to do so, less than they had before. But we need to be willing to be more broad-minded about all of the players that want to come to this game and bring some money and some effort to it, rather than looking for the Goldilocks solution of, well, we only want third parties, but not utilities, and we only want make-readies, but not owner-operator. Like all this, circular firing squad that's happened over the years is going to have to be tamped down in some ways to move forward at all.
Yeah, let me double down on that comment about Chelsea. You're absolutely right with signage, that EV drivers need signage, that apps are great, but when you're driving around the big parking lot of a huge mall looking for the chargers that are buried behind a hedge someplace, the app will only get you so far. It won't get you the last 50 feet to the charger if you can't see it and there's no signs. So yes, signage is really, really important, everything else aside.
But I would argue the signage is much more important for non-EV drivers, because the perception and awareness that charging is out there is one of the biggest hurdles. I can say there are 40,000 charging cords in America till I'm blue in the face, but no one's ever seen one. And even if they have actually seen one, they don't know what it is. It's preparing the broader market that is going to have to buy these things 5 years from now and getting them used to the idea that there is EV charging all over the place, all over the world in which they travel every day. It's not for EV drivers. They know how to find them. It's for the rest of the world.
Yeah, I editorialize here. When people walk into our showroom, I'll give a shout out to our friends at ChargeWay. But when we show them on a ChargeWay app or on PlugShare, here's all the chargers in the Portland metro region, that conversation is over. The anxiety about charging and where am I going to charge? Now, granted, we have a little more infrastructure than some parts of the country. But I often say it's like I never knew where the veterinary clinics were until I had a dog. And so I want to move on a little bit. I think I know what the answer to this is going to be, but we had a couple of questions about heavy duty vehicles, electric trucks, and so forth. And again, is this a time to maybe focus more energy? I know you're going to say both and, but is this a time when it makes sense to focus more energy on those kinds of vehicles maybe than we would have a year or two ago?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, no question. It was a need all along, and CARB has been working on advanced clean trucks rules and things like that. It has been a growing movement in that direction, but certainly as more people stay home and have things delivered to them, it becomes more important to get, as many emissions as we can out of goods delivery and all of those sorts of use cases. And same thing with street sweepers and garbage trucks and municipal vehicles and all of the other unsexy vehicles we don't think that much about, but at the end of the day are ripe for electrification to help move all of this along.
Okay. Well, at the other end, even though this was billed as a webinar about car sales, we've had a couple of questions about electric bikes and micromobility. Any thoughts or predictions about where that's going to go and what we should be doing to encourage electrification on that end of the spectrum?
Yeah, that's so interesting. I think it's really going to be interesting to see how micromobility plays out in the pandemic. So one thing we're seeing is, as Chelsea pointed out, there's like shortages of bikes. Everybody is getting on their bike and riding around because a bike is a great way to social distance and get some exercise and to get around. But also the dockless e-scooters like Bird and those are having a really hard time right now in line because I presumably because people aren't going to work and maybe aren't using those. But so I think micromobility is kind of taking a step forward, but it's shifting in ways that are a little bit hard to see right now exactly how that's going to play out. I would imagine that electric bikes sales are taking off. I don't know. I haven't seen any numbers, but that would be my assumption.
Yeah, certainly. And as this sort of slow streets movement has taken hold in different urban areas of dedicating a lane or entire street to walking and biking and other modes of transportation to give people more social distancing open space opportunities, that's also fostered the interest in bikes and other things. And this is, on one hand, yes, let's encourage that. And there's some conversation about how much of that is temporary versus permanent from an urban planning perspective. But this is also a nice pause opportunity to deal with policy of all kinds, whether it's encouraging cars and stuff that was starting to be in the works but can still be moved along, but also to deal with infrastructure and policy around micromobility. I mean, there's lots of urban cases where dockless scooters have been a pain in the ass, let's face it, but it doesn't mean we throw out that mode of transportation entirely, and we need to revisit how to make those things work, how to provide them appropriate infrastructure, lanes and otherwise, so that people are comfortable and safe using them. They're not trying to do battle in traffic with semi-trucks in the same lane. All of those things can happen in this period of relative downtime so that they can be better utilized going forward.
Okay. We have a lot more questions coming in than I know we're going to be able to get to, which is great for us, but I apologize for folks we don't get to. One very specific one, though, where I'd love your thoughts. Are we going to see any of the models being made in China, the more affordable electric vehicles, coming to the U.S. anytime soon? And maybe John.
Yeah, I don't think anytime soon. There are Chinese-made cars being sold in the U.S. already. One is called the Buick Envision. Another one is called the Volvo S80. You just don't recognize them as Chinese-made cars. But that said, the vehicles in China, the low-cost electric vehicles, were never designed to federalize to meet U.S. standards of things like safety, let alone to the build quality or with the features that American consumers now expect. So in the short term, no.
Okay, well, that was a direct answer. I think we're getting the subtle clue here that we need to wrap it up. I think we have time for one more question, and maybe I'll just end with this one to each of you quickly. So if you were a city, state, or other unit of government or NGO at this point trying to do your part to help drive more transportation electrification, what's one thing you would do that you wouldn't necessarily have recommended 6 months ago? One place you'd suggest people put some energy.
But I wouldn't have recommended 6 months ago?
Well, or that you would double down on now. That's fair too.
Signage.
Okay.
I would double down on exploring access to potentially multiple modes over ownership of anyone. That people will be needing a variety of things to accomplish their transportation needs, and that's going to look different at least for the next couple of years than it maybe looked in the last couple of years, and that we need to much better understand that and prepare to enable it as quickly as we can.
I would say consumer awareness, that, people's needs are shifting and the world is shifting in a lot of weird, unpredictable ways. People's lifestyles and what they want is shifting. And I think that continuing to beat the drum on awareness that as your needs shift, that you should keep EVs in mind and that maybe they fit for you in a way that they didn't. Maybe an 85-mile car didn't work for you before as one of the two cars in your house, but maybe it does now. So I think to continue to focus on awareness.
Great. Well, thank you all. And I think that's a great last point, that I know shifts in commuting and travel behavior happen when people have a chance to develop new habits. And we've all had to develop some very new habits in the last few weeks. So this is a kind of a teachable moment. So I think with that, thank you. I wish we could give you a real round of applause. If people want to use the little applause icon, that'll have to do. But thank you all for being part of this panel, and I'm going to hand it back over to Symbiote to wrap things up.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you so much to our speakers. If we did not get to your question today, don't worry. We will be sending a recap email, and we want to keep this conversation going. We did have a lot of great questions coming in, so do not worry. A recap email will be sent shortly. And we do hope you're able to join us on Tuesday, June 2nd, for our conversation on national stimulus proposals. We will hear directly about several of these leading national stimulus proposals with our speakers from Electric Drive Transportation Association, EDTA, the Sierra Club, the Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator, and Electrification Coalition, and the Blue Green Alliance. So we hope to see you then. And with that, I will sign off. Thank you again to our speakers today and our wonderful moderator, Jeff Allen. Thank you all and have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.